Welcome to Conversations on Communism. We're here today at the University of Westminster, and Henry and I are joined by Professor Richard Seaford of the University of Exeter and Dr Ben Harker of the University of Manchester. And we're here to talk about George Thomson, a communist, classicist, scholar of the Irish language and fascinating polymathic figure.
Ben, would you mind telling us who is George Thomson?
George Thomson was a classicist and a communist, born in 1903, radicalised at Cambridge in the 30s and became a very important figure in terms of the cultural networks and structures of the British Communist Party. I came to him initially because I was writing a biography of Ewan MacColl, and Ewan MacColl was very interested in Thomson's work and frequently cited it, especially the book on Marxism and poetry.
I didn't come to George through Marxism. A lot of people do. In fact, probably most people who are admirers of him come to him through their interest in Marxism. I came to him when I was 16 or 17 years old, and then later as an undergraduate. And I came to him because he seemed to me to provide the best answers to the big questions. And often he was the only person even asking the big questions. That's what I was interested in. Big questions like, why did tragedy begin when it did? Why did it take the form that it did? Why did philosophy begin when it did? Why did that take the form that it did? What does Orphism mean in terms of the social and economic context? And a whole number of questions like that, which nobody else was even asking. There's something he writes about a learned professor of Greek called Pickard Cambridge. It made a big impression on me. He wrote, Pickard Cambridge's mind operates in a narrow circle. Within that circle, no scholar is more thorough and acute. Outside that circle, he doesn't think at all. I was very impressed by that as a description of most of the people who were teaching me at Oxford, and indeed most classical scholars generally. So I was, of course, attracted by Thomson's polymathy, his refusal to respect the hyper-specialisation that has come with the intellectual division of labour. And that was combined with the most extraordinarily lyrical writing style.
So many of the books are based in lectures, and you feel that there's a sort of oral quality to them that carries through. I was just looking at his, it's really a tract that he writes for the CP in 1949 on communism and religion. But it's based on his talks, and it has that sort of immediate spoken quality is there.
There's a description of a old Irish lady on the Blasket Islands in his book. His most recent version of his time in the Blasket Islands is called Island Home. That's the best place to start with Thomson's experience of the Blasket Islands. He went to the Blasket Islands, specifically the Great Blasket, first in 1923. He met Maurice O'Sullivan. Together they published 20 Years of Growing and translated it. And in that work there is a lot of loving description of the people of the Blasket Island. There's one passage in particular in which he comes across an old lady, and she's thinking about her relatives, all of whom have been gathered away to Springfield, Massachusetts. And she talks about the island, and she does so in a poetic manner, using imagery which was the common property of the people of the island, but in a very poetic manner. And she assumed a kind of dreamlike state. And then suddenly she stopped, said goodnight, and was gone. And I'm sure that the lyrical speech of the Blasket Islanders had an influence on the way that George spoke, because he had that rather similar dreamlike quality, that lyrical quality, that allowing the imagination to take him over while preserving the perfect lucidity of the precise classicist. And that's an extraordinary combination.
This might be a good time then to address the question of Thomson's Marxism. And I wonder, Ben, do you know, so he was radicalised at Cambridge, yeah? Do you know anything about the circumstances of that and his connections with any other communists who were there? Or?
No, I mean, he wasn't, as far as I know, sort of given to that kind of self-revelation, really. There isn't much in the way of, there's no autobiography. The only thing I've found is there's a longish transcript of an interview that he gave when he was really talking about his close friend Douglas Garman, which is there's a transcript of that in Garman's papers in Nottingham. After Garman died in 1969, Thomson and Alex West, they always felt that Garman had been a sort of an overlooked figure, and they were keen to produce some sort of volume about him. That never materialised, but in the process of that, Thomson is recorded talking about his sort of intellectual and political trajectory. But my sense is that he arrives at Cambridge just a wee bit too late to meet that sort of first gathering of communists at Cambridge in the very early 20s that gathered around Maurice Darb. Ivan Montagu is there and goes on obviously to be a film producer and a sort of intellectual of film and a promoter of film clubs and a ping pong ambassador. And Alan Hutt, who goes on to be typographer and a journalist, and he spends most of his career at the Daily Worker, and A.L. Morton, the historian. They're all at Cambridge and becoming interested in Marxism very shortly after the Communist Party is formed in 1920. But Thomson, I think by the time he arrives, they must have overlapped. But I don't think I've never had a sense that he had much to do with them. And then he goes away, but he comes back to Cambridge in 1934, by which place the place must have had a very different atmosphere. I mean, in terms of its radical student politics. By then, there's a very active, a socialist club, which is essentially become a forum for communists. There's a journal called Cambridge Left up and running. John Cornford, David Guest, some of those, James Klugman. I mean, those very important communist Cambridge student activists are in town. Charles Madge, and people like J.D. Burnell are in the party and are starting to say in a very direct way that intellectuals can do work for the party by being eminent in their respective fields. You know, one doesn't simply have to subordinate one's sort of intellectual identity to the cause and do sort of party functionary work. One can be a paramount intellectual and enhance the prestige of communism through that. And I am guessing, because Thomson doesn't, I mean, Richard may know better, but Thomson doesn't, to my knowledge, reflect on that very much. But that's the sort of moment when he becomes a member of the CP.
Yeah, I read somewhere, I'm not sure if this is right or not, that he joined when he'd gone to Birmingham. He was teaching at Birmingham. I'm not sure if that's right.
He doesn't go to Birmingham until 37. He gets E.R. Dodds' old job. Dobbs goes to Oxford, and Thomson gets his chair, but he's already in the party by then.
Yeah, okay.
Thomson, he joins the party in 1935, I believe, and in 1935, the Comintern conference, Dimitrov said that scholars of the past have a crucial role in the struggle for the present. That may have had some sort of influence on him. By the way, when he went to Birmingham in 1937, the Vice-Chancellor took him aside and said to him, "Thomson, I'm glad you're here, Professor of Greek. I always think that classics is the best bulwark against communism."
It would be great to know how Thomson thought about those experiences on the Blasket Islands in relation to his communism, because clearly one thing that, interwar intellectuals across the political spectrum are wondering about is what culture was like before capitalism. That is a question that comes up. I mean, it's there in the Sacred Wood, it's there in the writing of Leavis, it's obviously there very powerfully, and Elinor's work draws it out brilliantly, but it's there very strong in literary debates in and around the Popular Front. But clearly, being in the Blasket Islands, and Thomson talks about that in Marxism poetry, but he feels that he's encountered some sort of incredibly rich oral culture, which is not sort of reified or fragmented or alienated by capitalism. That clearly is related in complicated ways to his political radicalisation.
Yes, he went there first when he was 20, and it's clear from the way that he writes about it, and it's clear from the way Blasket people write in their diaries and so on about him, that this was a life-changing experience. He's 20 years old. And he goes and he finds this society in which it's not just a matter of capitalism not having distorted it yet, but he does make that point actually in the introduction to Aeschylus in Athens. But it's an undifferentiated society. And it's a society that is without the contradictions that were so obvious in the capitalism over the water, in the sense that he says that this is a simple people with a simple culture, but it's perfectly adapted to their physical environment. He was, of course, very conscious that it couldn't last, and indeed that it shouldn't last, that these people had very little by way of material possessions and services and so on, and they were all left in the end. But he could see in it a perfectly undifferentiated society. There are no classes, but also there are no contradictions between their humanity, if I can use that term, perhaps I shouldn't, between their humanity and their language above all, and the physical circumstances and social circumstances in which they're living. So that, for a 20-year-old, was a very powerful experience which defined his communism, I think, in interesting ways. As you were suggesting, he doesn't, interestingly, say anything about Irish politics, or at least doesn't say anything known to me. He arrived on the Blasket Islands on the very day of the first general election held by the Irish Free State. But there's no mention of that. And in all his writings about Ireland, there's nothing about Irish politics, which would have, I suppose, been a distraction and a distortion of the idyll that he found on the Great Blasket. There's a sense in which, I mean, he's a very unusual communist. I mean, he stays active, Marxist-Leninist, to the day he dies in 1987. And a lot of people didn't, as you know. He does. He's unusual in that respect, because his communism is based originally on this experience of what life could be in a non-capitalist society. And he doesn't say much about, at least in the stuff that I've read, that you might expect about day-to-day events in Britain, for example. He will have remarks about the horror of unemployment and poverty and so on and so forth, but that's really not what he's interested in. It allows him to retain a very positive attitude to the world, in which he's largely ignoring the horrors and concentrating on the power of culture to change society, and the power of a changed society to give us a better culture. And this remaining positive is what allows him to be a communist to the day he dies.
I noticed that Yeats crops up a few times in his writing. I wonder whether was Yeats somebody who was quite important to him, do you think?
He quotes Yeats a number of times in Marxism and poetry, but I've always wondered whether that was sort of partly strategic, insofar as quoting Yeats would, authenticate or legitimate ideas that might, otherwise seem, rather challenging. There's one quotation from Yeats that sort of sits actually very oddly with the thrust of his own argument. Thomson has been arguing that poetry is, connected to production, that it's a form of sort of linguistic creative production. And then he quotes Yeats, in which Yeats is saying that poetry is a sort of passive state. It induces a sort of passive state. And there's a sort of tension between those two things. The other time that he quotes Yeats, he quotes the Galway races. And he quotes Yeats more affirmatively there. Yeats is talking about some sort of future in which, poetry is going to become the common property of all once again. I think the sort of subtext of that Thomson is saying is, I've got an idea how that might happen. I don't think that Yeats does. I mean, there's a sort of shared, utopian projection about culture somehow being returned to the people. But Thomson has a very concrete sense at the end of Marxism poetry how that is going to happen.
And obviously, like lots of cultural intellectuals at that time, he's very interested in the origins of cultural form. So could you say a little bit more then about how he saw the origins of poetry? I
mean, this is coming, out of Caldwell, and there's an insistence that one should sort of take an anthropological or sort of sociological view about the emergence of poetry, and he sees it arising in terms of productive relationships. He sees it as an attempt to master the material world, and so This is always running counter to the dominant sort of Marxist view at the time, or the orthodox Marxist view, which is increasingly becoming sort of codified in the 30s with Stalin and books like The Short Course, which, extract key passages from Marx and Engels and sort of, tell actors this is what you need to know. But the emphasis there is that culture is some sort of secondary derivation of economic processes that have already occurred. And the thrust of Caldwell and Thomson is that poetry is itself part of a productive process, and is dynamic and creative and needs to be seen in those terms. It's a way of apprehending and mastering the world rather than merely a reflection of it.
Yes, I can't remember much about what he says about Yeats, but I have a dim memory of him being attracted to a remark by Yeats about the relationship between poetry and magic. I mean, Yeats is a poet whose poetry has some relation to magic. And Yeats said something, and as such, of course, it should interest Thomson, because Thomson also believes, albeit in a different way, that magic and poetry are not two entirely separate cultural phenomena. They each have their place in his overall vision of the development of humanity. And Yeats even, I think, was of the view that poetry and magic should be studied scientifically. I think Yeats even uses the word scientifically, and that is applauded by Thomson. But as far as the question of the origin of poetry is concerned, Thomson's conception, and I think this is something he owes quite a lot to Caldwell for, is one of evolutionary anthropology or developmental anthropology, which is not just a process of development from a lower stage to a higher stage, but also a process of constant differentiation, not just the division of labour, but also the differentiation of basic human activities. For example, poetry on the one hand and science on the other hand, from the same material process through which apes become human beings. So he really is going back to a stage in which poetry is related to the mimetic, which is what the apes do, and science is related to the deictic, pointing, which apes don't do, but human beings acquire. There's a single matrix for poetry and for language even, and for science. That single matrix takes you back to the very origins of humanity. And poetry, science, other activities are differentiated out of that. So he refuses to accept divisions, ultimately, between poetry and everything else. And of course, he has a theory of grounding both language and poetry, which are the same sort of thing, language and poetry, in the labour process. So he has a theory about the origins of language and poetry, which he sets out, I think, most recently in The Human Essence, second edition, 1977. He has a theory of the origins of poetry and language in the labour process. And he gave me a copy of his 1977 edition, and shortly after he'd written it, there was an occasion when I went to see him, and he said to me, "This is the Marxist answer to Chomsky." Now, he doesn't mention Chomsky in the book at all. It's absolutely typical. I mean, he knows what he's doing. Chomsky's not mentioned in the book. The only texts mentioned in the books are the Marxist classics. That's typical. That he's just he's not critiquing a fashionable thinker. He's just focusing on what the Marxist classics can do.
And in that question of the origins of language in labour and in production, is there a differentiation of any sort between spoken and written language? So quite a lot of the Marxist writers in the 30s are very interested in the voice, in speaking. Okay. And you mentioned his kind of lyricism and the quality of his voice. And is that something that he thinks of poetry as being speech that's been captured?
Yes, captured and possibly rigidified. But of course, on the Great Blasket, that writing is just coming in and people use it, but most of the older people on the Blasket are illiterate. Some of the older ones have learnt to write in order to write down their experiences of the island, and you had these famous books by people other than Maurice O'Sullivan, which preceded Maurice O'Sullivan, about life on the Blasket. And George says, I think, at one point, well, all it was doing was putting into written form the stories that these people would tell by the fireside, which were in the memory. This was an oral culture. And in fact, there's one wonderful passage in Island Home where old Thomas, who's one of the first people to write the stuff down, and Thomson is saying it's just how they spoke, it just happens to be written down. And that's the great glory of it, because you've got an oral culture actually recorded in writing before writing has had the chance to change the nature of the culture. But Thomas at one point says that ever since he was taught to read the newspaper, he reads the newspaper every day, and ever since then he can't really remember the stories, so that literacy is driving out that oral culture.
He does talk a little, I think, in Marxism and poetry, I think it's there, about the way in which the richness of Homer is in part, the richness of Homer compared with other oral poems, or orally transmitted poems, is such in part because of the maturity of Greek writing at the point when it was written down, so it was sort of captured in its entirety. But he suspects that that there were similarly rich, similarly complicated oral forms elsewhere, and certainly when we get into the 50s and 60s, he becomes. I mean, that was his sort of rapport with someone like Ewan MacColl was in part because he thought that MacColl was doing interesting work around folk song, around. In the 50s, you could still, it seems extraordinary, but you could still go out into the English, mainly countryside, and meet farm workers, as MacColl did, who knew, carried around in their head a couple of hundred songs, many of which that hadn't been written down for a very long time. I mean, MacColl found it extraordinary, and I think Thomson also found it extraordinary. And MacColl was trying to do things with that. It wasn't just a process of archiving or memorialisation, but it was an attempt to stimulate new cultural forms through that material. Writing new songs, making radio programmes, making plays, and so on. I think Thomson was attracted to that dimension of the folk music revival because he saw that sort of business of trying to draw on the resources of the folk and create like and for the folk. It's something that MacColl was trying to do in a modern setting. It seems naive and problematic, but nonetheless I think it was a very powerful impulse for a decade or so in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. So we've mentioned Caudwell a couple of times, and I think we perhaps have to sort of explore Thomson's intellectual relationship with Caudwell a little bit. Perhaps is he sort of consistently Caudwellian? Is that a kind of bedrock for his major ideas about where culture comes from and what it does, or does he develop or break with that? I don't know if either of you have anything to.
Well, he mentions Caudwell in the preface to Aeschylus in Athens.
Which is published when, sorry?
1940, the first edition. Caudwell died 4 years earlier, of course, in the Spanish Civil War. He mentions Caudwell along with Engels, The Origins of Private Property, Family and the State, and Morgan, the anthropologist, as the three influential writers on his general approach. He also mentions a couple of classicists. But he doesn't quote Caudwell much in the book. There's one passage of Caudwell that he quotes. It's quite difficult to identify what he owes to Caudwell, but I think probably the main thing is it actually worked with his interest in the Blasket Islands, because Caudwell was particularly interested in the social origins of poetry. Poetry was not to be taken as a standalone given. It was to be envisaged as something that comes out of a certain kind of society. And it's, above all, and this was actually, it may seem obvious to us, but at the time this was pretty new, that the different forms of poetry depended on different social forms and different stages of the evolution of society. Now that's the fundamental idea for George, but I think it was Caudwell who first elaborated it, and certainly the first one who associated it with the concept of class and with Marxism. So I suspect there's quite a big debt of Thomson to Caudwell. Caudwell is more interested in psychology and Freud and Jung than Thomson is, and Caudwell is interested in the way in which capitalism and the division of labour and class oppositions create everyday neuroses. That's not the sort of thing that Thomson is interested in. And Thomson, of course, develops in political directions which it's impossible to know whether Caudwell would have followed because he died in 1936.
I think the debt to Caudwell was huge, and certainly in CP party terms, Thomson was sort of actively, promoting Caudwell's work. He wanted to see Illusion and Reality, taught, in party education sessions. There's a sort of post-war moment when national communist parties are looking for sort of national intellectual figures who might give sort of clues as to the national road to socialism that suddenly, communist parties are supposed to be following after the dissolution of the Cominform in 1943. And obviously Gramsci is the figure in Italy. And there's a sense in which Caudwell is being sort of set up for that part by certain sort of enthusiasts, of whom Thomson is one. So I think he thought that Caudwell could help the CP sharpen itself kind of in terms of its theoretical rigour, and he becomes a sort of very robust defender of Caudwell when that legacy is attacked. But I can't think that he doesn't critically engage with Caudwell's work anyway. I can't think of him making a single critical remark about Caudwell's writing. He does try and figure out what Caudwell wrote first, but that's rather a process of trying to make the body of work more coherent. But I think the relationship is one of a big intellectual debt, and then a subsequent sort of patient working through of key concepts. He talks about Caudwell being a kind of quarry for ideas, and you feel him going back to Caudwell over and over again.
So that sort of repositioning of Caudwell in the kind of the English Gramscian role, which is an odd reading of Caudwell. Do you feel like he extracts a sort of national frame from Caudwell? Because I don't think it's really there in Caudwell.
No, I don't think he's interested. He's not interested in Caudwell in that sense.
Right.
It's not. And again, the Popular Front is sort of interesting because if you look at Thomson's trajectory, you'd say he joins the Communist Party in 1935. That might lead you to expect him to be a sort of Popular Front communist in the sense that someone like Jack Lindsay is a Popular Front communist. Very committed to the idea that we can, sift through the national culture of the past, and that somehow this is going to prefigure or give us clues about a nationally grounded communism in the future. I think Thomson he's not in that game at all. Actually, he's conspicuously absent, if anything, from those debates that are going on in Left Review in the 34 to 38. I mean, I can't. You would know better than me, Elinor. But if he contributes to Left Review at all, it isn't conspicuously. I mean, it may be the odd book review. So those sort of places where that Popular Front political cultural project is being formulated, Thomson is not there. In terms of his communism, he's in many ways a sort of more old-fashioned figure. He's a Leninist, a vanguardist. He believes through his entire life in the dictatorship of the proletariat. He's not somebody who's interested in formulating some sort of gradualist road to socialism, and it's this that sets him at odds with the party leadership in the 40s and 50s.
So those clashes must have been quite dramatic then, based on that. What did they occur over, and sort of how close do you think he got to leaving or being expelled?
Well, he comes onto the National Executive Committee in 1947. This is the first time a university lecturer and intellectual, of that kind is on the National Cultural Committee, and I think in a way he is entrusted to do that, in part because of his orthodoxy in the past. The fact that he hasn't been theoretically deviant in a confrontational way, in the way that people like Jack Lindsay has. Thomson tells a story in that interview that I mentioned earlier, and he talks about at the time, this is in 1939, he's in Birmingham, he's living in a leafy suburb, he's teaching at the university, and he has profound problems with the Nazi-Soviet pact, and he contacts Garman about this and says, I feel uneasy about the party line, and I feel rather dislocated in my branch, which is very middle class, so people sort of like me, and Garman says to him, well, you should go and join a factory branch, go and sort of immerse yourself, more directly in the party and the class. And so this is what he does. He joins a branch, I think, in the Austin Car Works, and begins teaching evening classes to industrial workers, and feels his hesitations about the Nazi-Soviet pact don't go away, but he feels nonetheless kind of properly connected with the party and the working class. Now, at these kinds of experiences, and would play extremely well with the leadership of the CP. He is an intellectual, but he's not given to theoretical navel-gazing. He's willing to immerse himself in the party and the class, and his relationship with industrial workers is one. He's willing to teach and learn, and it's these kinds of positions, and I think that sort of openness that would mean that he would be entrusted as an intellectual to come onto the National Executive Committee of the party.
Intellectual knows his place.
Yeah, or yes, willing to subordinate his sort of to serve the movement in a direct way. Mm. This is at the same time this is the paradox. At the same time, he's advocating Cordwell's work, which is at variance with, as we said already, is at variance with the sort of approved theoretical models. But there's something about Thomson's character, I think, that this doesn't escalate into an open challenge in a way that, say, Jack Lindsay would go in at loggerheads and have the spattle. Thomson, just occupies these positions simultaneously.
I remember reading a Daily Worker article. He was talking about how to become a cultural or intellectual worker. He was kind of telling people what they were doing wrong and what they should do. Do you remember that particular episode?
Yeah, it's from the Communist Review in 1946, I think, and there may be a shorter version of it in the Daily Worker. But this is him saying that intellectuals do need to root themselves appropriately in branch life, and particularly in factory branches, and participate at that kind of grassroots level in communist politics. At the same time, people like Jack Lindsay are arguing that we need, a union of intellectual workers and sort of institutions that might sort of potentially sort of segregate intellectuals from the industrial struggle. Thomson is insisting that workers can, that intellectuals like him can, be directly involved in the running of the party at that level, and they can learn from that. Their experiences will be enriched by that.
I think this relates to what we were saying about his lucidity. And I went to 2 memorial meetings shortly after he died. One of them, there was somebody from the factory branch who thought the world of him, said he was always inspiring and never patronising. And if you listen to him speak, you can really understand that.